Good afternoon. Welcome to Robots and Red Tape. I'm your host, Nick Schott. Lucky today to have Mr. Eric Brown here with us. Eric, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
No, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely, man. It's a pleasure to have you on. Eric, so for the listeners, could you tell everybody just a little bit about yourself, your background, your journey, and how you got here?
Eric Brown Jr., I am a technologist, a mentor, coach, founder of Elevate Coaching and Consulting. We focus on helping individuals and organizations understand the complexities of innovation and be able to go from idea to being able to realize value, leveraging emerging technologies like generative AI, augmented and virtual reality, and just leveraging it for business impact as well as society impact.
Well, fantastic, man. Fantastic. And how did you become a coach and kind of where did you work before and where'd you cut your chops?
I have been working with technology since like age 12, 13. My first job was at Chuck E. Cheese at like 13. And then
Hmm.
from there, I went and worked at CompUSA, Circuit City, really was really into selling tech, starting to build computers. From there, I went on to Delaware State University, and it was there where I had the opportunity to get some great co-ops and hands-on in IT, worked at Monsanto, a biotechnology company,
Hmm.
focusing on Oracle database administration. From there, I had a decade career at Microsoft, focusing on kind of the transition from virtualization to cloud, and then now from cloud to some immersive technologies like augmented virtual reality, and
Hmm.
now in the generative AI space. But during my time helping individuals and organizations kind of understand what's the art of the possible, but
Hmm.
then going from, hey, this is a cool technology to what problem are you really trying to solve for?
Hmm.
And what are your goals and metrics that makes investing in this technology worthwhile? And then it was in that moment when I was like realizing that we always have this shiny object syndrome. And I
Right.
was like, it's great to talk about the latest and greatest, but then how do you go from uh, understanding what the technology can do to saying, well, here's how it can actually add value. And it
Hmm.
was there that I found that coaching and being able to be really curious and ask a series of question and discovery was really helpful in my practice, helping individuals along their journey and being somewhat like that guy that I'm a big Star Wars fan of like, hey,
Hmm.
how am I able to help you along that journey and be able to ask the thoughtful questions that may be problematic and you trying to reach these aspirations.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And so now you do a lot of work helping organizations figure out how to implement AI in their environments. Is that correct? Or just is it all like cutting edge technologies, or are you focused on AI specifically?
So I'm focused on emerging technologies, and so AI and augmented virtual reality are areas that I focus on quite a bit.
Hmm.
But in general, I think strategy, as far as like, well, how can technology be a catalyst or tool to improve your business or to be able to impact community in a positive way? As of now, the topic of discussion probably primarily has been generative AI,
Hmm.
but it spans beyond just that scope. I look at technology as an umbrella, as like a tool, and so
Hmm.
figuring out, depending on what problem you have, what tool makes sense. So it's not always going to be emerging technologies. It may be something that you've had for 10 years, is never really leveraged. And so I look at it as how am I able to help you come up with a strategy and a change management process to get results.
Absolutely. So when you think about, or now, are you primarily worked in the commercial sector, nonprofit? Have you worked in the public sector as well, like with government?
So in the past, majority of my experience was in public sector as well as commercial enterprise. I've also worked with small, medium-sized business startup community as well. Right now, primarily focusing on the medium sized businesses, but I think that really depends on the customer and their challenges. But I've have experience across sectors.
Absolutely fantastic. And what are when you think about, specifically speaking about AI and implementation strategies, how do what are some of the key differences you can think of organizationally between public sector and private sector, and then further between like larger private sector companies like you've worked at like Microsoft and some of these small and mid-sized organizations that you're working with primarily now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that from a strategy standpoint, the frameworks work pretty well across sectors. but there are some key differentiators. So when I think about public sector in particular, from a regulation standpoint,
Mhm,
FIPS or FedRAMP. There's definitely, depending on the agency and the type of data they're dealing with, there may be other things that they have to be considerate of. Also, kind of the procurement process
mhm,
and the implementation process takes longer, lots of different checks and balances. But I think in all strategies that working with, it starts with understanding and having an assessment of like, do you know where you are?
mhm,
So everyone wants to be modern, wants to be on the edge, but it comes back to what problem are you trying to solve? Whether it's focusing on the public, or being able to help individuals within Department of Transportation or Department of Education, Department of Justice. Everyone has their own particular problems to solve, jobs to be done. But in doing so, figuring out, okay, how are you able to do this in a secure, compliant way that's scalable, but also doesn't cause harm in the process? And it takes a lot of due diligence to understand, but I think it begins with understanding what problem do you want to solve and where are you and what is your skill set, and what capacity do you have in
mhm.
solving that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100%. I appreciate that. I agree with you entirely. And I mean, you only have to think about how, sometimes if, patches get rolled out correctly, like the entire global infrastructure can kind of get put on pause, like what happened end of last week with our friends over there at CrowdStrike. And you're right. And so what are some of the key success indicators that you see organizationally when it comes to implementing some of these new technologies?
Yeah, I think we live in a data-driven insights world, and I think before even beginning, knowing exactly what impact you're trying to make. So if it's all right, reducing time or creating capacity for more personalized engagement, or reducing the amount of errors,
Mhm,
whatever it is that you're doing, understanding before even kind of going on the journey to say, okay, here's the problem, here's how we're measuring it today, and by implementing XYZ, we would like to be able to impact this number in some way, form, or fashion. And I think that with clients I've worked with that would have the ability to articulate the problem and have a measurement associated with it, that's always a good indication that, okay, we're going on a journey where we're able to mark our progress. And
mhm,
so when you're coming in vague, say, we just want to use AI, I want to use this tool, and like, well, all right, for what purpose? How
mhm,
are you measuring it? So I think that that's a sign of success when you're able to measure it clearly. In
mhm,
addition to that, I think that one of the pitfalls that happens in organizations is you may have the aspiration, have the way of measuring it, but if you don't have the staff, if you don't have the capacity internally or with the vendor to be able to implement it or don't have that skill set, that could
mhm,
be problematic. And so I think once you have that clear vision of the problem to solve and you have the capacity and the team and the talent to do it, that's also um, you know a roadmap for success. Another thing that I've seen that has been helpful in that process is being able to have kind of an agile framework of saying, well, while we're going and implementing this, let's go take a pause and be able to test and monitor and say, like, hey, as we're going through, is it actually meeting the metrics or meeting the standards that we had in place? And
mhm,
so what's interesting is typically when you think about innovation and technology, you're focusing on IT. But I think this is an interdisciplinary type of effort of saying, well, hey, we have people from the business, we have the data scientists, we have the project managers, we have buy-in from different stakeholders to say, as we're going through this, let's iterate and see, hey, this MVP or this proof of concept or this pilot, what's that feedback? And
mhm.
let's take that information from that loop and ensure that we're checking all the boxes.
Absolutely. So what are some of the more interesting use cases that you've seen effectively for this technology? I think, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, that a lot that and we see it in different cycles, right? There was blockchain was one previously, which just was not super sticky. Before that, there was cloud. I'm probably missing a couple in there, but when you start thinking about that, just these different cycles over time, what are some of the more interesting use cases you've seen as it relates to generative AI? And why do you think, or do you think that this is going to be like a sticky one like cloud, or one that seems really cool like blockchain, but kind of just is not present in every environment like, cloud is?
No, that's a great question. I think one of the debates that's going on right now is like, all right, is this a hype bubble? And like just like
Mhm,
anything else, like, all right, we've seen this technology before, we've seen how it's been adopted and how maybe it wasn't as impactful as desired. I think that there is a coming wave,
mhm,
and it may not necessarily look um, like we think it is, but it's definitely going to have a lasting impact. And the examples that come to mind, I think that when it comes to being able to have personalization, as well as like transcription and translation, the very simple technology, but being able to quickly implement something. I think what's interesting is like everything builds on top of each other.
mhm,
And right now, when you think about AI as an umbrella, generative AI kind of being a sub of that, you're dealing with data. And
mhm,
so sometimes when you're going back, it's like, well, what does our data estate look like? What is the kind of a foundation of an organization? And we have the ability to accumulate a lot more data than we have before. We have the ability to store a lot more data than we had before. And I think that's one of the catalysts for some of the transformation we're seeing with generative AI is the fact that we have so much data.
mhm.
And
Absolutely.
so I think with the use cases that I think are low hanging fruit, but also are going to be able to shift things is now when it comes to development, you have to leverage different languages. You have to have a particular skill set. Not to say that generative AI is going to even the playing field fully, but
Mhm,
it does allow power users or just being able to use natural language to do really complex tasks. And
mhm,
so I think that the fact that we're able to proliferate more data and now we have individuals that are not necessarily dev pros able to create programs and solutions and architect things on their own, it's definitely pushing it so that there's going to be more things available. Now,
mhm,
how efficient that is, we still have to work within guidelines and frameworks to make it done. But I believe now the time to market is definitely shorter.
mhm,
We have so much data that we're able to have a lot more efficiencies. And so I said all that to say that, technology builds on top of each other. I
mhm,
think that data is the foundation. We're able to create more data, but now we're able to do more with that data, leveraging natural language. In
mhm,
addition, from an accessibility standpoint, right now we're having this podcast in English. I don't speak Spanish, I don't speak French, I don't speak several other languages, but we
mhm,
can quickly translate this to all of the various languages in real time and have it be localized, which was a process that took a lot of effort in the past. Now
mhm.
that's a click of a button. And so being able to reach more people, being able to convert data, just using natural language is opening up new opportunities that we didn't have before.
Yeah, I completely agree with you when it comes to things like translation and personalization. I think that as far as low hanging fruit, an area that I've always thought would be great is like you think like tier one, not necessarily tier one help desk when it comes to IT, but like, tier one support desks as it relates to, I mean, any 800 number that you call. I don't know about you. I don't know about you, Eric, but I've never had a good experience calling an 800 number. And I think that'll like, especially as you look at all of like the touch tone things that have been like the touch tone technology that's been present for, I would say, all of our lives. But then in addition to that, they've been working on doing some work and recognize people, recognize voice, but it's still very, very limited in that capacity. And I think things like that would be, especially as it relates to organizations that are very high touch as and customer service oriented as a business model, whether that be, hotels or airlines. Well, airlines not so much, but hotels, or credit card, banks and credit card companies, things like that, where they're now able to speed that process along and get you to the right person more quickly, or even solve some of those issues for us entirely without us having to talk to a person, which I think would be their goal business wise, right, from a cost perspective.
No, that's been a common use case. And to your point, I think that what generative AI has been able to do as well is add levels of realism
Hmm.
that makes interacting with a bot um, more human centric or more friendly.
Hmm.
And I think that, whether it's being able to leverage human like voices, being able to have kind of natural conversations where it knows your intent and is able to kind of think about what is the best next step for this individual in an authentic way,
Hmm.
is something that is going to transform kind of the initial entry level opportunities. one thing that comes to mind is I think the Department of Education, federal aid, they have a chatbot that has had millions of interactions
Mhm,
of some of the scenarios. Like, what are the most common questions I may have? Being able to have a conversation with that bot and then be able to get to those resources or be able to transfer a human. But I think that flow and that engagement is becoming more natural, leveraging these
mhm,
tools. But more importantly, what's going on in the background is the data collection of saying, well, now we have insight on what are the most common questions. How can we improve the process
mhm,
based on this insight and intel that we're gaining in real time? And so I think that's the part that's really interesting, is seeing how leveraging predictive analytics or different algorithms to say, hey, in addition to being able to meet customers where they are, how do I know where they're going, and being able to make things more efficient so that
mhm.
we can prevent some of the challenges we had historically.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating when you start thinking about that. And I mean, to the point that you made earlier, where about technology building on itself, right? I completely, I completely agree with you first. But as organizations look to implement AI, what are some of the key, underlying pieces that they need to have in place and need to have tight to ensure that they can successfully implement these things, implement AI on top, right?
Yeah, so to that point, data is the foundation. So, like, what does your data strategy and infrastructure look like today? Oftentimes, you want to go and create the super 3D star, but like, what does your standard star look like?
Mhm,
And being sure that you have that pipeline and that data management efficient, have the ability to store that data, being able to read and write that data effectively, I think is key. In addition to that, kind of to the point you made earlier around the recent global events as far as an IT, like what is the security and the infrastructure security of that data?
mhm,
Because it's great to be able to have efficiencies, but if you're doing it in a way that's leaving you with a larger attack vector or risk, it defeats the purpose.
mhm,
And so I would say that having clear data strategy and understanding of like, all right, for whether it's generative AI or some other type of custom AI solution, where's the data and what does that flow look like? Where's that housed? Is it on-prem, hybrid, et cetera?
mhm,
I would say the next piece is governance and ethical considerations. You need to have a responsible AI framework or policy that you're aligned with. I
mhm,
do work within the EDU space, and they have their own requirements. But one of the things that the Department of Education, in partnership with Digital Promise, came out with was a framework guidance for developers. If
mhm,
you're going to build AI solutions for ed tech in the EDU space, they're like, okay, here are things you need to have in your framework for best practices. But one of the key things with EDU, but also applies to other industries, is where's the human in the loop? Where's the teacher in the loop? Where's that subject matter expert in the loop? So that you're not necessarily building things in isolation, and
mhm,
understanding of what are the biases and ethical considerations for whatever solution you're building.
mhm,
And so I think that once you have that data, once you're able to have that governance and framework, but also understanding, what is the overall interdisciplinary team that's going to be necessary to really evaluate and see if this is going to be as impactful as you desire. But also have kind of those phases of saying, okay, here's the MVP, the proof of concept, and being able to get that feedback and make iterations, because this is ongoing effort. And I think that one of the challenges that, is across the board in different countries as well, is saying, well, for every organization, they have a different posture of risk and what their policies and procedures look like.
mhm,
And there's governance from, the National Institute of Standards, NIST, for Department of Education, from the AI Bill of Rights, and it has kind of a filter down. But when it comes down to your individual organization, that particular leadership team has to understand, okay, what is our posture going to be in alignment to these other frameworks, and what does that time frame of rolling that out look like, and
mhm.
how we're going to assure that we're in compliance. And I think that takes work, it takes
Yep,
time, but the pieces are there. It's just making sure that you have it and you have clarity in the process.
absolutely. I would also assume there'd be a lot around, especially with your posture, would be ongoing updates, ongoing changes, right? As and absolutely right when it comes to different types of organizations, right? So, I run a mental health company. It's one of the areas I'm in, as you sit and look at, like, we absolutely have a lot of risk as it relates to HIPAA. But we also don't have our own on-prem EHR that we use, right? All of that is with another company, and if I had to guess, they are sitting in like AWS or Azure somewhere, right? So I don't know how incumbent that is on us as an organization to have a deep understanding into, or if we're covered from that perspective, right? But healthcare is going to be very different from finance, from insurance, from a lot of these government agencies as well.
No, that's key, and you have to do your own due diligence. But one of the things, especially when working with vendors, which is helpful, so you don't have to do all the groundwork yourself, is a shared responsibility model. And I
Hmm.
think it's important with whoever vendor you go with and whatever solution you're coming up with to say, okay, what is that vendor responsible for, and what am I responsible for, and what is that gap, and ensuring that as things change on their side, that you're also able to keep up with those updates and ensure that the end customer is able to be in the right standing. But it's exciting times.
Hmm.
But I think it's important to be able to, do your own due diligence, but also revisit and see where there's updates as things change.
Absolutely, my favorite thing you said though on that last little spiel there, Eric, was that, or the answer. I shouldn't call it a spiel. The last answer to the question that we had in the conversation, is forcing human in the loop, and from a workflow perspective, how are you going to ensure that your people are still involved, right? Because I know that you've done it where we go into, whatever, whether it's, Chat GPT, I guess Gemini, Claude, any of these models, right? Um, I don't know how much you trust them from an accuracy standpoint. What I can tell you is that I certainly don't trust any of their, I don't trust any of their, anything to put it out from without reviewing it, without reading it through, without doing fact checking. But also, in addition to that, I think that, like, ChatGPT is the one that I'm personally most familiar with because I use it more in my organizations. Is that, like, it uses passive voice constantly. It, like, the voice sounds wrong. It sounds weird. It doesn't read as if I was writing it. It doesn't read like myself. And then I've also seen it where, from a resume, like, because I do a lot of work in recruiting as well. So, I rarely ever see it from I rarely ever see, I shouldn't say I rarely, on occasion, especially over the last couple years, I've seen people's resumes where they have just like insert company here or insert statistics there. And you can tell that they clearly just copy and pasted out of
Mhm.
ChatGPT or whatever LLM and just didn't read it, right? So how are we going to force humans into the loop from a workflow perspective is 100% key.
No,
Uh,
it is. It is key. It is key.
mhm. So when you're setting and building these systems, and how do you think organizations should do that? And what are some things that they should be looking at from a human in the loop perspective?
No, this is key, and I think going back kind of to one of your original questions, like Eric, well, how is coaching involved, and why
Mhm.
there's an emphasis on coaching? And I think that when leveraging technology as a tool, we make a lot of emphasis on the tech stack, but not necessarily the human stack. And I
Mhm.
think that in order to have solutions that really impact businesses and communities in a positive way, you have to have a combination of people, process, and technology.
Mhm.
And when it comes to the people and process side, I think that these mandates and these governance policies, ensuring that there's a human loop is key. But I think in general, when I think about AI and its impact on society, I think we should look at it as a tool, but also a collaborative intelligence or an augmentation to say that, it's able to help with some of the redundant tasks, but it's important that we focus on critical thinking and judgment skills because those are things that the tools inherently don't have that ability to do. And
Mhm.
so, although it can be able to spin out something and make it seem like it is accurate, it's important for a subject matter expert to be able to look at it and say, yes, the framework and outline that was from 10 years ago, but
Mhm.
there has been some updates. And although the framework looks right, these things that they're saying right here are totally wrong and be
Mhm.
able to make the changes. And so it does help with productivity as far as getting, a good percentage of the way there, but it's important to have someone that does that in and out, and as things change, to be able to look at whatever that output is and make those corrections.
Mhm,
Um,
100%. Go
yeah,
ahead. No, no, go ahead, Eric, please continue.
yeah. I also think that, one of the things as leaders we need to really focus on is showcasing how these tools are empowering people,
Mhm,
and making sure that the human loop is key. Because if it's just like, oh, it's an automation now, we have this thing that goes and automates all this stuff. Like, well, how is it benefiting the person to say, all right, that task you were doing, that job to be done, that was something that was taking up a lot of time and it wasn't the best use of your time. Now you're able to do X, Y, and Z and be able to, maybe look at the output of the chatbot and be able to decide, what are the use cases that are we should focus on going forward. And so just showcasing where the judgment, and the critical thinking skills are going to be necessary to make things more efficient, but making sure that in the whole process of implementing these tools, that you are empowering human intelligence in the process. And I think it's an art of the way it's communicated and shared within an organization to ensure that that's the sentiment that's received.
absolutely, absolutely. And so what are thinking about all the implementations you've seen, right? And at first, I love how you're so much of a technologist. You refer to a workforce as the human stack, which I'm, is I see how your brain thinks, man. But what are some of the most what are some of the keys as far as far as having talked about all these different keys that go into a successful implementation, what are some of the, and you don't have to name names, what are some of the best and also some of the worst implementations you've seen? Not necessarily been a part of, but what are some of the best and worst that you've seen?
I would say that, just without saying any names per se, when it comes to the technology industry itself, when you think about most companies, whether it's an Airbnb or a Netflix, individuals who were birth organizations that were born in the cloud, and have automation and data as a part of their core business model, I
Hmm.
would say holistically, they've been able to leverage AI in a way that's been efficient because that's a part they grew up with that baseline.
Hmm.
I would say individuals or organizations that this is a muscle that they're developing sometimes have made mistakes in the process because they haven't necessarily had good foundations when it comes to data and security and compliance and being able to use these use cases. So I think when it comes to automation for um, whether it's sales or inventory, those use cases are perfect, for AI and generative AI. When it comes to personalization, when it comes to sales or marketing, those are avenues that I've seen very efficient solutions leveraging this technology in a very simplistic way that's had lots of gains. And
Hmm.
so I would say those are some use cases that have been great. When it deals with um, impacting people's lives or various biases or things that have a level of gray area judgment, although the architecture from a technology point was great, when it comes to the people involved or the data accuracy or the biases in the data as far as the intent versus the outcome, those
Hmm.
are some scenarios where there's been some challenges and there's been some things in news around that. And I think that it's important for us as a collective community, as humans, as different industry leaders, to think about as we're coming up with solutions. Um, there is inherent bias and ethical considerations in historical data. When we think about if you comb the data from the whole internet over history, historically we've made mistakes, and so those mistakes are going to show up in some of these algorithms. And so I think one of the pieces is if you're dealing with something that's going to impact lots of individuals, being able to intentionally ensure that the outputs and the interactions represent or equitable or accessible for
Hmm.
different types of individuals is something that holistically we have to continue to strengthen what that looks like. And I would say a lot of the challenges aren't necessarily in the technology and what it can do, but it's the way it's implemented and how we're able to ensure that we're keeping human intelligence at the center, but also that we're empowering people, but not amplifying our own flaws in the process.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that to your point about bias within the data. I personally, like, in certain use cases, don't think that's inherently a bad thing. For instance, some, like, certain diseases are more prevalent in different either socioeconomic or cultural, cultures, socioeconomic groups or cultural groups than others. And I think that that could be a good use case where folks that, either your family or, culturally, you have a higher risk of things like breast cancer or different cancers or heart disease or blood pressure, things like that. And understanding that and having understanding that and building that into, say, a personalized healthcare model, that's a guy I count that as a good thing, right?
Yeah.
But when you're doing things like identifying people wrongly in disproportional rates based on what they look like, that's all. I mean, that's a bad thing, right? And so I'm with you. I think some of that can be good, some of it can be bad. But I also think that the biggest part is we need to be aware of it, and we need to have honest conversations about it, and honest conversations about what the intended result is, right? Healthcare is not necessarily a bad place to group somebody based on their family, their background, where they're from culturally, where they grew up, and apply it there, but and apply different or more nuanced approaches instead of a one size fits all. But I also think that it should stay there and it shouldn't bleed over into other models and other things as far as, how people are treated or interact with algorithms, right?
Yeah, I think the scenario that comes to mind is when it comes to like getting a loan for a house or being able to get credit for a bank or whatever the case may be. Those are scenarios where being mindful of how these algorithms are developed and transparency around it is key to ensure that you're not disproportionately misrepresenting or preventing individuals from getting opportunities that can help them thrive in the process. And so, no, I think transparency is key. And I think one of the things I heard recently someone say is like, I want to be able to see explainable AI.
Mhm.
I want to explain how this works. And
Mhm.
oftentimes in some scenarios, like it's a black box. And so
Yeah.
being able to say, well, how did it come up with this answer per se, with LLMs in particular,
Mhm.
large language models, that's sometimes difficult to do. But I
Mhm.
think as developers, as organizations, as technology leaders, it's important to be able to articulate and translate, how something works and
Mhm.
how it's beneficial. Because when it's the level of ambiguity or vagueness, um,
Mhm.
there's lots of judgment and lots of interpretations that may not be positive. And so, especially when it comes to going back to the question around what's the difference between a startup or a commercial organization and a government entity, the government is going to impact all the citizens. And so,
Right.
those they have to go through another level of scrutiny to ensure that those type of biases or errors are not there because it impacts so many people.
Absolutely. And your point about explainable AI and not really knowing why the AI says what it says. Obviously, in my healthcare, in my mental health business, healthcare, I know a lot of people are pushing towards like an AI therapy chatbot or something like that to, there's frankly not enough therapists out there in this country. And some of the things like, the interstate counseling compact, which is where if it goes live, if it's on schedule to go live at the end of the year, where there's reciprocity across all the states as far as like counseling licenses and things like that, which I've been a proponent of for years. That's great, right? And that could potentially help solve some of this problem in the short term. But like one of the things that I would worry about personally if I was either involved in developing or creating a product around that, or looking at potentially implementing one within my organization, is that like at some point somebody's going to do something crazy, right? Whether it harm somebody, harm themselves, do something, and when they're asked why, they're going to say because my therapist or because the AI bot told me to do it, right? And like that's just a level of liability. That's just, I think about how, like, think this level of liability, but also like, and that the terms and conditions are going to be set up in a way to hold the company, hold whoever the company is completely blameless from any result or anything that it says. But like, first, that shouldn't be. But second, absolutely, what kind of data is it trained on? How is it trained? How is it taught? And also, how do you mitigate it? You know, hallucinating, right? And because hallucinations are, I mean, I'm pretty sure those are like system faults, right? Like that's just like it's a failure of getting a coherent, cogent answer out of this system overall. and they've just rebranded it as a hallucination. But like, how do you actually understand what data and what it was, why it said what it said is super key in more delicate implementations.
Yeah, and I think within the healthcare space in particular, there has to be such a level of audit trail, and um, recall of those track histories and alignment to each customer. And so I know that um, there's debates within kind of the therapy space around even recording meetings or being able to have it take notes. There's definitely solutions out there that are compliant, but
Mhm.
every practice has their own posture as a result of the liability associated with having that information. Because sometimes when it comes to e-discovery and the legal process, more data is not good. And so
Yeah.
I think it really depends. I think that's when it comes to judgment. Every organization leaders are going to have to make this judgment decision to say, all right, from an ROI standpoint, is it giving me more productivity gains than risk?
Hmm.
And being able to have that level of posture of saying, okay, am I willing to take that risk for the gains? And so it is something that every organization is kind of going through that process. But I think going back to coaching, being able to ensure that as innovators and early adopters, are you taking the middle with you? And
Hmm.
I'm referring to kind of the middle of that adoption curve. The late adopters and the laggers. Are when you're taking an organization, it's great to be able to say, hey, I could tell our board members or put in our press release that we're leveraging AI. Everyone now says we have an AI solution, but in saying that, are you causing harm or are you only catering to a small subset of your customers or even your internal team and leaving a lot of people behind in the process? And so one of the things that I'm a big advocate of in this time and day is like, you know what? Back to your point around, all right, is it going to be as big as hype as people are making this out to be? I think time will tell. But I think it's important for us as leaders today to say, yes, this technology is transformational, but
Hmm.
how are we actually empowering people to understand how to leverage the tool? And how are we focusing on change management and AI literacy to make sure that people feel comfortable to understand, okay, what are the use cases? Why is it valuable? When to use it? And actually when is probably not a good time to use it. And I
Absolutely.
think that's more of a judgment and a people process collaborative intelligence conversation more so than just bits and bytes. And so that's one of the things that I'm actually excited about in this season is like having conversations with leaders to say, okay, every organization is different. Everyone has a different posture and demographic, but making sure that that's a key part of it, that it's not just a small conversation group of individuals, engineers in a room saying we're going to do this thing. And the subject matter experts or the domain business team is not necessarily in the loop until we're doing POCs.
Absolutely. No, no, absolutely, Eric. I completely agree. We've talked a lot about what an organization needs to be ready from an infrastructure perspective, right? And we've also talked a lot about, potential impact on people that work in a business. And so what do companies in your opinion, what do you think they need what do you think that they need to have set up, not just on the infrastructure side, but on the personnel side? Because like we both know we've talked a lot about data, we've talked a lot about data infrastructure. What are some of the people that are who are some of the people that are needed in these organizations? What talent do they need? And how do they go about, not just from a hardcore data infrastructure perspective, but like from a personnel perspective? What do companies need to be really be successful in deployments?
Now, that's a great question. I think what's interesting is um, understanding who you have currently is the first starting point. Understanding what is your skill set, what is your talent, um, landscape look like? What type of individuals do you have in your organization?
Mhm.
Because it become a reason why I'm starting there is because sometimes people are thinking, oh, I need to go and get new people. And in some scenarios, you may need to go out and hire individuals with particular skill sets. But also, I think one of the things I'm emphasizing is what does upskilling and reskilling look like? To
Mhm.
say, all right, we actually have great talent that has great domain expertise and historical insights and really great customer relationships. Now, what are the problems that we're trying to solve? What are the jobs to be done today or tomorrow, or as we're looking at our North Star or our horizon to say, okay, all right, what are those skills look like?
Mhm.
And let's be able to figure out what is that um what does that skill mapping look like for that job to be done, and how does it look like to what I have today? And I think that's kind of the first starting point of saying, okay, what is the landscape, but also what is the gap in
Mhm,
regards to skilling is concerned, and having efforts to upskill who you currently have, and depending on timing and goals or project timelines, what are our priorities for hiring to be able to fill those gaps in the near term. But when it comes to what that looks like, from an AI perspective or generative AI perspective, typically some of the roles that come to mind: data scientists,
mhm,
data engineers, data analysts. So there's different aspects kind of the data pipeline, from an architecture standpoint, who's actually managing those databases, creating those tools, but also architects that are able to um, build solutions across what your current infrastructure looks like, whatever
mhm,
your infrastructure looks like today, whether it's on AWS or Azure or Google,
mhm,
in addition to what it is that you aspire to. So I think it's an interdisciplinary effort, between individuals that do have those deep technical expertise, but also within um, the HR,
mhm,
as well as when you think about the business itself. Who are going to be the end users leveraging these tools that you're creating in house or for customers, and ensuring that they feel comfortable using these tools or being able to collaborate with these co-intelligence or co-pilots,
mhm,
as they call them, to say, as you're doing your work, what is this tool or bot that's going to work with you? How are you upskilling your individuals to understand why that's valuable?
mhm.
Because one of the things I get pushback from leaders is like, "Hey, Eric, we went and we built all this stuff, but no one's using it. We don't have any adoption."
Yeah.
And I think that that piece around, okay, you have the infrastructure, you have that team, but when it came down to the change management and implementation of the end users that are going to use it every day, the people who are with the customer facing, et cetera, they need to be trained and upskilled as well,
Mhm,
to be able to know how leveraging this tool in their workflow is going to be more efficient for them. Because if not, they're going to do what they've been doing that has allowed them to get the progress they've had thus far. So it's a combination of lots of things, but I would say, just to kind of summarize it, understanding where you are today in your talent pipeline,
mhm.
understanding what skills or gaps are there, and making sure that you have a change management plan to upskill, reskill, and hire individuals to be able to fill that gap.
Absolutely. I love the emphasis on reskilling, training folks and reskilling people because I'm with you. I completely agree. That's absolutely the place to start. It's like let's assess where we are internally and let's go about let's rework things from there because just because somebody might not know how to use this new fancy AI tool or know how to build one doesn't mean that you want to throw out all that that organizational knowledge, right? And all of that understanding of your organization, where you are in the marketplace, and where you've been and where you're going, right? That's a lot of knowledge to get for you to lose, if you don't retrain somebody. But how do you think organizations should, if they do kind of if they are they when they after they do this assessment and understand, how do you think organizations should go about attracting and retaining the folks that are, the data folks that are so in demand right now?
No, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the industry and organization.
Mhm.
I think that building a culture of learning and development is something that I think is attractive, across the industry. An environment where you are able to gain new skills, and being in an environment where it's okay to fail and to try new innovative things definitely gets the innovators and early adopters on board. I know that even within the government space, they now have chief AI officers or innovation officers, and they're definitely changing the posture, a historic narrative of government not necessarily being as innovative, and so making this say,
Same
hey,
time, I talked to somebody earlier today who's a senior data analyst at one of the, let's just say, an agency, and they're still running on Access. So,
it's a work in
like,
progress. It is a
you
work in
know,
progress, but I say that to say that so you're right. On paper versus reality is always different.
Mhm.
But I'm saying that there is definitely a push from a
There is.
culture perspective to say
Yeah.
we would love to aspire to have this culture. Now back to coaching, understanding the 360 and say, all right, do I have enough awareness to know, is what we have in our mission statement the reality experience for our employees? That's something different. But in regards to what is attractive. I think being able to create learning cultures, because as you know, every
Mhm.
week, like there's a new tool, or
Sure.
every 3 months, there's a new update from the major players in this
Mhm.
space. And so being able to have an agile approach to say, you know what, we're able to have levels of consistency and standards, but also have room to be able to iterate and make adjustments where it makes sense.
Mhm.
And I think that takes a level of culture and leadership to be able to make that a reality. So I think leaders need to be able to create and craft those environments. But also, I think it's important to have learning and hacking be a part of the flow. I know that, at Microsoft, we had hackathons every year,
Mhm.
where we're able to intentionally say, you know what, what's a problem that we want to solve, and let's get a team, a group together, and let's aim to solve for it. I think having that mindset of being able to build and leverage the tools that we're building, and be able to help individuals find out in that process who are our champions, who
Mhm.
are our early adopters. And I think that also identifies how we can create ways of being able to help individuals help others in the process. But if it's stifled, then it's going to be difficult to do that. And so it's an art, but it can be done.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, we've talked a lot about, I think, a lot of the things that go into, into my next question, or talked around it, around, you know, how can businesses and government, I mean, how can we as, business leaders and folks in government, ensure a smooth transition to AI? And a smooth rollout of a lot of these systems, outside of the technology stack and the people and the systems, I'm sorry, the processes internally, is there anything else that we didn't touch on, we didn't think about as far as like a smooth transition to not just standing up and creating the systems, but in addition to that, ensuring that they're actually being utilized, and I think also actually are solving a real issue that the end users are having presently.
Yeah, man, you touched on a lot of things there. Three things come to mind.
Hmm.
I think the first phrase that comes to mind is building with community, not for community.
Hmm.
So building with your end users or your target demographic, not just for them. Back to the teacher in the loop or the subject matter expert in the loop, ensuring that whoever you're building for, as you're getting your development team, coming up with these innovation strategies, going back and saying, well, how can we bring in some champions from the field and have them be a part of that loop? Because when that's not happening, I think there becomes a level of lack of transparency and trust.
Hmm.
Then it becomes a little bit of skepticism. So even if it's there, will people actually use and adopt it? But if they're a part of the process, it's something that we built, not something you built for me.
Hmm.
And I think that's important because sometimes they build it and afterwards say, "Oh, give us feedback." Like, well, you didn't give me, I didn't give a chance to give you feedback when you
Hmm.
were coming up with the problem we're trying to solve. And so I think that's one. And kind of the other two pieces there is that trust and transparency. I think outside of technology and the processes, it's like, do I trust the technology? I've had conversations, especially with the EDU space. I have a passion for education and learning and development. I've been at some different universities over the summer, and as I'm talking about AI and co-pilots and things of that nature, even within the younger demographic, there's definitely a resistance to being able to leverage it. They're like, "Oh, I'm going to be cheating," or there's different stigmatism on leveraging these tools. But also, I looked at the teacher in the back, and as I was talking, I would see them kind of like move around their seat and kind of like get their ideas together. Like, I have a question. I'm like, "Okay, what is your question?" And they're
Hmm.
like, "What about the mental health? What about all the negative things that could potentially happen, or how this could proliferate?" A lot of negativity that's already in the world, and that's a fear and an anxiety that does need to be addressed in a proper way. And I think sometimes leaders focus more on the innovation and problem solving, but not about the people and how they trust or feel about these technologies, and
Hmm.
ensuring that you keep it human centric and saying how it's a tool to advance and empower and not to replace or proliferate things that are already negative in their systems and in their culture and environment. And I think that takes, like I said, back to coaching. It takes leaders to be able to be adaptive and transformational to be able to do that. And I think it's important to invest in leaders and making sure that their teams understand outside of just understanding AI and all the complexities there, but also understanding change and being able to navigate change when there is direct opposition, and when there is a lot of disagreement.
Hmm.
I think we live in a time in history, but also in culture where you're going to be in your team is going to be divided in various ways and thoughts and
Hmm.
processes, and being able to say, how can we focus on what we have in common and what that central goal is something that it takes great leaders and managers and directors to be able to make that a reality. And so the technologies there is definitely lots of implementation and frameworks that are out there. But to your
Hmm.
point around the agency that's maybe using access, like they have it on paper, but how are you able to make it real in a way that you're building trust and momentum with your people?
Absolutely. And how do you think organizations should measure success when it comes to AI implementations?
So it really depends. I think initially, being able to identify and measure what that the problem impact or pain is within their organization today,
Hmm.
and also think about, okay, what is an estimate of what this tool or solution, how it's going to impact that number or that sentiment, however you want to measure it. I
Hmm.
think is a key indicator, but
Hmm.
also I think another measurement is as you're going through and implementing, just getting that feedback from the customers and the experience and the team as you're going around it. So there's the various frameworks on measuring it, but I think knowing and understanding the pain and the problem really well, having that as a number, and then being able to create ROI based on that previous number.
Mhm. Awesome, man. I really appreciate that. I appreciate all the knowledge you've had here today. Before we wrap up, is there anything that that you would like to mention or would like to bring up that we didn't discuss today?
No, I think one thing I guess I can close with is, implementing strategies and the frameworks are amazing, but it's important that you invest in the human intelligence and the human stack, and
Mm.
it's important to ensure that your leaders have the ability to have that transparency, but also awareness to be able to navigate the change, because there is a wave coming, and it may not necessarily be as big as the bubble or as the hype is claiming it, but it
Mhm.
is a point in history where there's going to be lots of shift and disruption, and
Mhm.
it's important to ensure that we are empowering as many people in the process. And although there's going to be change and shifts in what jobs to be done, to ensure that there's a roadmap and a change management strategy for those individuals in your organization or as they're trying to elevate and grow their career. But I think that's really a human centric challenge, and I think that leveraging coaching as well as consulting to be able to help what that looks like. Sometimes it's important to get a external perspective. One of the things that a coach shared with me a while back that spoke to me is that it's hard to read the label from inside the jar.
Mhm. Yeah, you can't see the forest from the trees, 100%. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that, there absolutely is going to be a lot of change. I spoke to some high school interns last week. I was talking to them about how there used to be I'm sure you've heard I mean I don't know if you've seen them, but I'm sure you've heard of them like I have. Like, you remember the old ice boxes, like before freezers were a thing. Like there was a whole infrastructure and a system set up where people would deliver ice to your house on a
Yeah.
basis and put the ice box in. And in addition to that, all of that ice, like that wasn't, there wasn't freezing technology yet. That ice was actually harvested from nature. And it was, and one of the things that I found interesting is like 100, 100, whenever it came out, like, I mean, it was 100 years ago or so, the companies that were in charge of harvesting and delivering all of that ice were so afraid of the freezer technology. I mean, clearly they should have been, but they actually ran a lot of scare tactic ads all about how organic ice is healthier for you than non-organic ice. And it's like I like the concept it's kind of funny when you think about it in retrospect of like, well, yeah, of course they were going to get taken over, but at the same time, to your point about you don't want to be the late adopter, right? You don't want to be the last one off you don't want to be the last one on the bus. You don't want to be the last one. You don't want to be the last one because you only need to look at places like Blockbuster and understand what happened to them and to many, many, many other businesses over the last 20 to 30 years when they just couldn't innovate and couldn't continue to change. And I forget who did the study, but I read this study recently where um I read the study after I heard about it at this event where people that use AI to augment them doing their job right now are measured at 30 to 40% more productive than those who don't. And so I would encourage everybody that listens to this to understand the power of these tools, understand what they can be used for, but also understand that they are like as much of calling it as much as you want to call it artificial intelligence, they're not smart tools. They're still pretty dumb, and it's pretty early in the phase. And so everybody should be out and understanding what this is and finding ways to play with it and touch it and work with it and use it, not like just for fun, but to also understand how it could positively impact you on a day-to-day basis and how it can augment you and augment what you're doing.
No, that's phenomenal, and I totally agree. One thing I'll add, you mentioned the scenario between the ice box and the freezer, that industry, that technology. What's interesting is I also heard kind of someone talking about Coca-Cola
Hmm.
because of the refrigeration industry, the refrigeration, they were able to launch, and now people are able to store sodas in their refrigerators, and they're obviously $1 trillion company. But thinking about how they leverage the innovation of the time to be able to start a whole new business model. And
Hmm.
I think that AI itself is a powerful tool, but it's like really what are the companies that are going to leverage the technology to be able to transform going forward as the baseline.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Eric, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation here on Robots and Red Tape.
No, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, take care.